Okay, so have you ever wondered why the prices at the pharmacy are all over the place? Like why one month your prescription is one price and the next month it's totally different.
It's kind of crazy, right? Like you go to pick up your meds and you just never know what to expect.
Yeah, and why is it such a hassle to get the medication that your doctor actually prescribed for you?
I mean, sometimes it feels like you're jumping through hoops just to get the meds you need right.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to look at today. We're doing a deep dive on a part of our healthcare system that most people have never even heard of.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. Like it's this huge part of the system, but it's totally behind the scenes.
Right. These are pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs.
PBMs, and they're like a middleman in the whole prescription drug process between like your insurance company, the drug manufacturers, and your local pharmacy.
Exactly. And they have a huge impact on how much your medications cost and how easy it is to get them. But most people have no clue what they are or even that they exist.
So that's our mission in this deep dive, right? To really understand how PBMs work and what their impact is on you.
Right. And to understand why this should matter to you as a patient.
Absolutely. And to help us understand all this, we're going to be talking about insights from this interview with Mike Papantonio.
Okay, so who's Mike Papantonio?
Well, he's a senior partner at a law firm,
Yeah.
Levin Papantonio, I think, and he wrote this book called The Middleman.
The middleman. Okay.
Yeah, and it takes a pretty critical look at the PBM industry, so it's a really interesting perspective.
And he's not just some random guy with an opinion, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
He has a ton of experience in this area.
Yeah, he's been going up against major industries for years, including big pharma.
So he knows his stuff.
Yeah, he really does, and he's not afraid to call things as he sees them.
I like that.
Yeah. And one of the first things that really jumps out at you when you hear Papantonio talk about PBMs is the language he uses.
Oh, yeah. What does he say?
Well, he calls their practices mobster conduct.
Mobster conduct.
Wow. Yeah. And he uses terms like kickbacks and extortion.
That's some pretty strong language.
It is, right? But when you hear his reasoning, it starts to make sense.
Okay, so what's his reasoning?
Well, he argues that the PBM industry basically operates without any real regulation or accountability.
Nobody's watching them?
Pretty much. There aren't really any checks and balances to keep them in line.
So it's the Wild West of healthcare?
Yeah, kind of. And when you consider how much money these companies are making, it's pretty concerning.
Okay, so how much money are we talking about here?
Well, Papantonio points out that just three major PBMs, Express Scripts, CVS, and Optum.
CVS is a PBM. I thought they were just a pharmacy.
Well, they do both, actually. They have their own pharmacies, and they act as a PBM for other pharmacies.
Wow. Okay, so what about these three?
Well, together, those three companies bring in revenues of over $150 billion every year.
$150 billion with a B.
Yeah, with a B. That's a crazy amount of money.
It really is, and that's just those three companies, right?
Right. Imagine how much the whole industry is raking in.
So this is a huge business.
Absolutely massive. And it's not just about big numbers, right? This has a real impact on people's lives.
Right. Of course, how much we pay for our medications, but are there other impacts?
Yeah. So we found this story about an 88-year-old who needed medication while they were traveling.
Oh, gosh. Traveling at that age must be hard enough already.
Right. And even though they made arrangements for their meds, everything got messed up.
What happened?
Well, their medication ended up sitting at their empty house while they were out of state.
So they didn't have their medication when they needed it.
Exactly. And it caused this huge delay. And they ended up having to pay for overnight shipping to get their meds.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, and it's not an isolated incident.
So why do these kinds of things happen?
Well, Papantonio says it's because PBMs are increasingly prioritizing their own pharmacies, especially mail order services.
They have their own pharmacies.
Yeah, a lot of them do. And they might make it harder or more expensive to fill your prescription at a local pharmacy. Well, they might charge higher copays or make you go through this prior authorization process if you want to use a local pharmacy.
So they're basically pushing people to use their own mail order pharmacies.
Exactly. And that can lead to delays and problems, like in that story with the 88-year-old traveler.
So it's not just about where you fill your prescriptions, right? PBMs also decide which medications are covered by your insurance in the first place.
Absolutely. And Papantonio says that PBMs basically tell drug manufacturers, you want to play ball, you got to give us big rebates.
Rebates meaning discounts.
Yeah, basically. And he calls these kickbacks, remember?
Right, right.
And he says they tell drug companies, give us these kickbacks or we'll take your drug off the list of medications that insurance will cover.
So if a drug company doesn't play by the PBM's rules, their drug might not even be an option for patients.
Exactly. The PBMs have a ton of power over which medications are available to you.
And I'm guessing that impacts the price too, right?
Oh, absolutely. But when we talk about high drug prices, most people immediately think of big pharma.
Yeah, like the drug companies themselves.
Right, and they definitely play a role, but Papantonio says that PBMs are a huge part of the problem too.
Okay, so it's not just the drug companies that are driving up prices.
No, the PBMs are in there too, and Papantonio says they might even be a bigger factor than big pharma in some cases.
So they're not just processing claims, they're actively influencing drug prices.
Exactly, and he has this crazy example to illustrate this point.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the example?
So he was taking a deposition in Amsterdam.
Amsterdam, okay.
And it was related to a specific birth control pill.
Okay.
And in the U.S., that exact same pill costs like $765.
$765 for birth control.
Yeah. Isn't that insane?
That's outrageous. And what did it cost in Amsterdam?
58 cents.
58 cents. That's a huge difference.
Right, like a ridiculously huge difference. And the person he was interviewing in Amsterdam, the reason for that difference is basically because we can get away with it in America.
We can get away with it in America. What does that even mean?
Well, Papantonio says it means that PBMs have this power to just jack up prices in the U.S. market.
So they're taking advantage of this system.
Basically. And he even says that some medications are marked up by like 5,000% to 6,000% in the U.S.
5,000%. That's insane. Are you serious?
Yeah, he's serious. And he says PBMs are a big reason for those ridiculous markups.
Where is all that extra money even going?
That's a great question. And it's something that needs more investigation.
So this all sounds pretty bad, but is there like a specific example of how this impacts people?
Yeah. So let's talk about insulin.
Insulin. Okay, so this is a life-saving drug for people with diabetes.
Exactly. And the cost of insulin in the U.S. is outrageous.
I've heard stories about people rationing their insulin because they can't afford it.
It's heartbreaking. And Papantonio calls the PBM's role in this whole thing a gangster undertaking.
A gangster undertaking. Okay, that sounds intense. Can you elaborate on that?
So he says it's like a protection racket. The PBMs basically tell insulin manufacturers, if you want to be on the list of covered medications, you got to pay us rebates.
Rebates, again, with the rebates.
Yeah, and he explicitly calls them kickbacks.
Right, because it's like the drug companies are paying the PBMs to favor their products.
Exactly. And if a drug company doesn't pay up, their insulin might not be covered by insurance.
So even though their insulin might be just as good or even better than another brand.
Right, and that leaves patients with fewer options and potentially higher costs.
This whole thing is so messed up.
It really is, and the price difference for insulin is just mind-blowing.
Okay, so what are we talking about here?
So the same amount of insulin that costs about $98 in the U.S.
$98? That's already a lot.
I know, right? But in other developed countries, it costs about $7.
$7? That's a huge difference.
And get this, the estimated production cost of insulin is only $2.
$2. So we're paying like 50 times the production cost.
Yeah, basically. And Papantonio says this markup is largely because of PBMs.
So they're making a killing off of people who need this life-saving medication.
It's truly awful. And this is forcing people to make impossible choices.
Yeah, like choosing between their health and putting food on the table.
Exactly. And it's not just about food.
Yeah.
People are having to make all sorts of sacrifices just to afford their insulin.
This is a crisis.
It really is. And it's not just anecdotal either. There's actually a lawsuit that's been filed against PBMs.
A lawsuit about what?
Well, they're being accused of inflating insulin prices by a whopping 1,500%.
1,500%? Are you kidding me?
I wish I was. But this lawsuit really highlights how much PBMs are contributing to this problem.
It's infuriating and scary.
It really is. And this brings up a really important question. Where is the government in all of this?
Yeah, like shouldn't someone be regulating these PBMs?
You would think so, right? But Papantonio says there's basically no meaningful oversight of this industry.
No oversight, so they can just do whatever they want.
Pretty much. And he's pretty critical of the Department of Justice for not doing more to hold PBMs accountable.
What does he say they should be doing?
Well, he says they've had plenty of opportunities to go after PBMs for potential antitrust violations.
So they could have taken legal action against them.
Yeah, but they haven't really done anything. And Papantonio thinks it might be because they see white-collar crime as less serious than other types of crime.
So like they're not taking it seriously.
Yeah, that's his take on it. And he argues that the entire PBM industry could be reformed with strong executive action and a mandate from the DOJ to really investigate these companies.
So he thinks the president and the DOJ could step in and fix this?
Yeah, that's what he's saying.
Okay, interesting. And is this like a new problem? Or has this been going on for a while?
Oh, it's been going on for a while. Papantonio even claims that the DOJ under Eric Holder during the Obama administration also didn't do much about this.
So it's not just a problem with the current administration.
Nope, it's been an issue for years. And he alleges that the reason they didn't act then was because of financial influences.
So he's saying that PBMs had some political pull even back then.
Exactly. And he makes another pretty serious claim.
Okay, what's that?
He says that there are 4 politicians right now, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats.
2 from each party?
Yeah, and he says they've been getting tons of money from the PBM industry.
Campaign donations.
Yeah, and he claims that this financial support has been directly blocking legislation that could help lower drug prices and make medications more accessible.
Blocking legislation for how long?
He says for about 5 years. So they've been stalling progress on this issue for a long time.
Wow, so these PBMs, they have a lot of power.
They really do. And they're using that power to protect their own interests, even if it means that people are struggling to afford their medications.
It's a messed up system.
It really is. And it's not just the PBM's fault, right? It's a systemic problem.
Right, like the lack of regulation and the influence of money and politics.
Exactly. It's this whole web of interconnected issues.
So let's try to sum this all up.
Okay.
Our deep dive into pharmacy benefit managers has shown that they are extremely influential in the U.S. healthcare system.
Yeah, and they operate with very little regulation.
And Mike Papantonio compares their business practices to mobster conduct involving kickbacks and extortion.
And those practices have a huge impact on how much you pay for your prescriptions.
And whether you can even get the medications that you need.
Right. And it's important to remember that high drug prices aren't just the fault of the pharmaceutical companies.
The PBMs are a major factor in all of this, too.
They're these powerful middlemen who are often working behind the scenes to drive up costs.
And create barriers to access for patients.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've talked about how this impacts real people like that 88-year-old traveler who couldn't get their medication.
Right, and all the people who are struggling to afford their insulin.
So what can we do about this?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. But what are some things listeners can do right now?
Well, I think the first step is to just be aware of the problem.
Right. Knowledge is power.
Exactly. And once you understand how PBMs operate, you can start asking questions.
Like what kinds of questions?
Well, you could call your insurance provider and ask about their relationship with PBMs.
Okay. And what else?
You could contact your elected officials and ask them about their stance on regulating the PBM industry.
That's a good idea because they're the ones who can actually make changes to the system.
Right. And I think it's also important to examine your own assumptions about why your medications cost what they do.
So, like, don't just assume it's big pharma that's to blame.
Exactly. Do some research, ask questions, and make informed decisions about your healthcare.
I think that's great advice, and it really comes down to this. We need more transparency in this system.
Absolutely. We need to know how these PBMs are operating and what impact they're having on our healthcare.
And we need to hold them accountable for their actions.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is about people's lives and their health.
It's not just about profits. It's about ensuring that everyone has access to the medications they need.
Exactly. And that's what we should all be fighting for.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. I think we uncovered some really important information today.
Yeah, it was great to break this all down, and hopefully it's empowered some listeners to take action.
That's what we hope for, and we'll be back soon with another deep dive on a topic that matters to you.
See you then.